Hello, this is Matthew Quadraro again, and in my second video, we're going to be talking about how to actually create geometry within Creo. If you recall from the last video, we kind of got acclimated to our environment a little bit, so we're going to skip over most of that. Feel free to revisit it if you need to, and we're just going to go right ahead and create some geometry. So what might we actually want to create? Well, I've prepared a little sketch of an imaginary chassis that we might have used, and we might have decided we need to make. Now you can see that it's a nice drawing. Maybe it's something that we came up with after brainstorming. It's got some dimensions, it's got labels, but you can see that it's not perfect. There's some errors here, mistakes. Things aren't quite to scale or in the correct perspective. Lines aren't straight. So we're going to start by creating this piece within Creo in a couple steps to kind of clean that up and make our documentation look nicer. We're going to start by building this piece of plywood that you see here. It's kind of a custom part. Having a drawing of this will be very helpful. So let's go back to Creo. And we're going to do this by creating an extrusion. How do we create an extrusion? Well, we build a sketch. There are two ways to make this. Number one is to click on the sketch tool and define the plane we want to sketch on. Number two is to just click on the extrusion tool right off the bat. And then we'll click on the plane that we want. Right now we're stuck with the main datum planes. But if we had some geometry in this three-dimensional space, we could select the plane that we've already defined using that model. But let's stick with the datum now. Alright, and here we are. We've entered our sketching configuration, and you can see up here that we've got two new tabs. That was the extrude tab that we were just looking at. Now we're on the sketch tab, and you can see all the tools that are associated with it. We can go back to these other tabs if we wanted to, but we're going to stick with the sketch tab. From here, we have sketching geometry that will allow us to actually make shapes, and we've got geometric constraints and dimensions that will allow us to define those shapes. So, this is kind of a wonky angle, so I'm going to go ahead and push this button right here, the sketch view button, which snaps us to a parallel view of this particular plane that we're sketching on. Other buttons to note up here are the refit button, which will bring our view back to the geometry we've defined if it starts getting a little out of hand. The named views, which if you click on it gives a drop down of important views like top, left, right, and the standard orientation, kind of an isometric view. There's the sketch display filters, excuse me, which is another drop down that will show and hide different things. For instance, a grid, we can hide that if we don't want the grid. Dimensions and vertices. It's useful if things get a little too busy on the screen, but remember what you've disabled and enabled up here, or you may find yourself not being able to find things that should be there and you've just forgotten. So let's go back to our plane, and let's start by making this square here. It's 12 inches by 11 1/4 inches. You can see that there are a bunch of tools here. Some of them are pretty crazy, like the spline tool. You can make a lot of very interesting arcs with that. And there actually is a rectangular tool right here that will allow us to make a rectangle pretty easily, but I'm going to stick with the line for the purpose of demonstration. So you can see I clicked on the line. The tool is now selected. To create a line, I left click and I move my mouse around. You can see that the line is snapping to horizontal and vertical, and you can see the little H and V right there. And to start with, I'm going to make kind of a crazy box. Alright, so you can see that you can just sequentially click and it will make a new line. Now that I've completed my shape, I'm going to push escape. And I'm still actually within the line tool. You can see that it's still highlighted right here. I can continue to make shapes as I see fit. I push the escape button whenever I'm done. And if I push the escape button again, I leave the tool. You can see that the tool is no longer selected, and we've made all kinds of crazy up here. Now what exactly is this mess? Well, let's start by simplifying, getting rid of the stuff we don't need. We'll push the refit button, and we'll take a look at what we've got. So remember that I said that Creo defines everything based on parameters. Well, it always needs these parameters. Creo demands that everything in space is defined, and it's done so by creating what we call weak dimensions. Now, what a weak dimension is simply a dimension that Creo has put in to help define the geometry in its place. But we can get rid of those weak dimensions by putting in our own. You can see that weak dimensions come in all shapes and sizes. You've got angular ones and you've got length ones. But rather than putting in dimensions on our own first, we're going to start with some geometric constraints. You can find all those up here. So let's click the vertical constraint and make the walls of this box vertical. Click on the tool, then I click on the line, and now it's snapped to vertical. And you can see the little V has appeared here. That V means that there's a geometric constraint on this line that holds it to vertical. If I push escape to leave the tool and start to drag things around, you'll notice that this line always remains vertical, whereas other lines do not. So let's go ahead and define the rest of these sides. You can see I use the horizontal tool for the top and bottom. I push escape to leave the tool. And now let's re-examine what we've got here. You can see that we're actually missing quite a number of dimensions. Creo has automatically gotten rid of the weak dimensions it put in by itself to make way for the dimensions that we've added, the strong dimensions. Now, where do we go from here? Well, we can see right off the bat that our feature's way too big. 276 inches is a far cry from 12. So why don't we double click on our dimension and put in what we actually want. 12 and 11.25. Now, you'll notice that these dimensions are a little different. They're a darker blue, and they're actually labeled as strong dimensions. Strong dimensions are dimensions that we've added. Creo gives them priority, and weak dimensions will disappear in lieu of the strong ones that we've added. But you'll notice they're still modifiable. I can dynamically drag our shape around, and our dimensions change. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to correct these dimensions. And now, holding the control button, I select both of them, and then I'm going to right click on them. Now Creo wants you to hold right click for a little longer than you think you should, but trust me, it does work. And I'm going to go to the lock option, and these dimensions are now locked. You can see that they've turned red, which means, and if I try to dynamically drag things around, it no longer changes those dimensions. So why don't I move this back and pull in some of these dimensions. We'll refit to our geometry. And here we are. Now, we really can't have this two-dimensional sketch lying around in space like this. We may accidentally move it, or Creo may misunderstand where it's supposed to be. So why don't we constrain this left-hand point to our origin? And we'll use the coincident constraint to do that. Push the coincident constraint, click on the corner, and click on the axis. And we'll just do that for the other axis as well. And now this point is constrained to both the x and the z axis, putting it on our origin. I push escape to leave the tool. And there we have it. Nice box, fully constrained. Now, we don't actually have a box though, do we? You can see that there's this house-shaped cutout in here in addition to these holes. Let's focus on the cutout with a 60-degree angle up there. Although the dimensions are a little sparse, we'll go ahead and fill those in kind of just on eye. This is a practice part after all. So how do we do this? We go up to our line tool. You can see that the shading has disappeared. We click on the edge, and we'll make a little house. Push escape to leave the tool. Push it again so that we return back to our dimensioning environment. And you can see that things are a little different. These lines are green now and our shading has disappeared. Why is that? Creo doesn't really know what to do now that this line isn't really continuous. We have this section here. Maybe that's to be extruded, maybe it's not. It doesn't know. So we're going to go ahead and use the delete segment tool up here to try to dynamically trim these sections. How does this work? Well, select the tool. You hold down the left mouse button, and you can see I'm drawing this little red line. I'm doing it off in space just so you can see what it does, but anything this line crosses will be deleted. So let's try. There it goes. Gone. So now I push escape to leave the tool, and our shading is back. We now have one continuous segment. Let's add a dimension. It says 60 degrees in the drawing. We'll lock that dimension. We'll use an equal constraint. We'll push the tool. Select one line. Select the other. Those lines are now equal. We're going to push escape once. Notice that our tool is now selected. It's still selected. And we're going to click on two different lines. Push escape once to leave our selection. Push escape again to leave the tool. So you can see now we have L1, these being the lines that are all the same length as L1, and we have L2, these two lines being the lines that are the same length as L2. You can see we can dynamically drag things around and those lines remain the same, even as well as the dimension that we've locked here. Now, these lines aren't actually in the middle. We need to figure out how to make this symmetric, don't we? Well, we can do that using a center line and a symmetric constraint. So let's start by making a center line. You can see here that after I've selected the center line tool, as I drag along our top axis, or our top edge, it'll snap to the M point, the midpoint of this line. I click on that and I snap to vertical. You can see the V has shown up here once I reach the vertical. And I push escape to leave the tool. This line is now constrained vertically and to the midpoint of our shape here. I can now use a coincident constraint to hold this point to this line. There's still some dimensions here that haven't quite been filled in. We're just going to make up some numbers because this is a pretend part after all, but always ensure that your dimensions are accurate. Otherwise, your piece is just not going to look right, and consequentially your robot won't function. So I'm going to lock each one of these dimensions. And here we have it, our two-dimensional sketch of our part, true to as many dimensions as whoever made the sketch gave us. So now that we're done and everything is fully constrained and doesn't move when we try to drag it around, as you can see me trying to do here, we're going to push the OK button up here in the upper right hand corner. Immediately it jumps to the extrusion tool. See, we're back to that tab, and you can see a preview. If we zoom out enough, you can see how far it's extruded, and this is much too far, 216 inches. So let's cut this down to 0.5 inches. I'll just click anywhere. We'll refit, zoom back in, and this looks good. There are other options here for the extrusion, but we're going to ignore those for now. We're just going to go ahead and click OK. And here we are, our first part. In the next video, I'll go a little more in depth on how we're going to finish fleshing out this part, and I hope to see you there.